The afternoon sun cast a diamond-like shimmer across the turquoise waters of the Starboard Marina Yacht Club in Miami, a world hermetically sealed in opulence where gleaming white mega yachts bobbed gently in their multi-million-dollar slips. The air itself seemed different here, thick with the scent of salt, expensive sunscreen, and the floral notes of champagne being poured into delicate flutes. On mahogany decks, men and women in crisp white linen and designer sunglasses laughed with a carelessness that only generational wealth could afford, their conversations a low hum of stock tips and vacation plans. In stark contrast to this gilded serenity, the port authorities' patrol boats moved with a functional, unglamorous purpose at the edges of the marina, their uniformed officers viewed less as protectors and more as part of the hired help, a necessary but easily dismissed fixture in the landscape of the elite. It was a place built on the clear, unspoken hierarchy of wealth, where every interaction was measured by net worth. On the sprawling aft deck of the Apex, a vessel so large it cast a shadow over its neighbors, Arthur Sterling held court. At 58, he was the physical embodiment of his own ruthless success, his silvered hair perfectly coiffed, and his tall frame draped in a tailored polo shirt that cost more than a public servant's weekly salary. His eyes, the color of cold steel, scanned his guests, a city commissioner, a banking magnate with a practiced, calculating charm that concealed a profound emptiness. He gestured with a hand weighed down by a $100,000 Patek Philippe watch, but the movement was mechanical, devoid of warmth. He was a man surrounded by symbols of connection, yet profoundly alone, his inner world a fortress built to protect his status from a world he viewed with contempt and suspicion, a world he had conquered, but could never truly join. The serene bubble of privilege was pricked by the arrival of a man who did not belong. Officer Ben Carter stepped onto the dock beside the Apex, his simple, functional uniform, a stark declaration of a different reality. With 15 years on the waterfront, his calm, observant eyes had seen every form of arrogance wealth could buy, and he moved with the quiet dignity that power could not purchase. He held a clipboard, his expression polite, but firm as he requested permission to board for a routine safety check. A deckhand, annoyed by the interruption, reluctantly led him below deck. Minutes later, Carter re-emerged, his duty compelling him to report a critical violation. The yacht's fire suppression system certification had expired 3 months prior, a serious but easily correctable safety issue. The discovery was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, a small tear in the flawless fabric of Arthur Sterling's curated world. The news was relayed to Arthur, whose face tightened into a mask of pure indignation. He strode to the railing, looking down at Officer Carter, not as a man, but as an inconvenient insect. An expired what? He scoffed, his voice carrying across the now silent marina. He snatched the citation from Carter's hand. Do you have any idea how much this vessel is worth? What my time is worth? In front of the silent, watching elite, he theatrically ripped the paper into pieces and let them flutter into the water. He then fixed his cold gaze on Carter and delivered the crushing blow. People like you work for people like me. Know your place. He pulled out his phone, dialed the police commissioner directly, and turned his back. I have an inconvenience here that needs to be removed, publicly stripped of his authority. Officer Carter gave a stiff nod, turned, and walked away, the burn of humiliation, a fire igniting a silent, unyielding resolve in his soul. The drive back to Arthur's residence on Star Island was a silent journey through a world he owned, but did not inhabit. His mansion, a 20,000-square-foot marvel of glass and white marble, was less a home than a museum to his own success. It stood cold and imposing against the Miami skyline, its vast, empty rooms echoing with a silence that no amount of wealth could fill. His staff, a small army of maids, chefs, and groundskeepers, moved through the space with hushed efficiency, their eyes always averted, their interactions laced with a palpable fear. They were impeccably paid to be invisible, to cater to a man who demanded perfection, but offered no warmth, a ghost haunting the monument he had built for himself. The air inside was always a perfectly controlled 72 degrees, sterile and lifeless. His evenings followed a rigid, lonely pattern. After a solitary meal served on a dining table that could seat 30, he would retreat to his study, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound books he never read. He'd pour a glass of Macallan 1926, a Scotch worth over $1 million a bottle, but the taste brought him no pleasure. It was merely a prop, another symbol of a victory that felt hollow. Tonight, the memory of Officer Carter's dignified face, even in humiliation, intruded upon his solitude. It was the man's quiet lack of fear, his refusal to be truly broken, that gnawed at Arthur. It was a currency of spirit that Arthur couldn't comprehend, let alone purchase, and its existence was an affront to the world he had so carefully constructed. He found himself staring at a framed photograph on his desk, the only personal item not curated by an interior designer. It was of his son, Mark, taken 15 years ago. They were smiling, a rare moment of connection before the chasm of Arthur's ambition had swallowed their relationship whole. Mark now lived in Oregon, a carpenter who had deliberately chosen a life of simplicity, a life that was a quiet rebellion against everything Arthur stood for. Their last conversation, a bitter argument over the phone 2 years prior, had ended with Mark saying, "You don't have a son, Dad." "You have a balance sheet with my name on it." The words still stung, a truth he perpetually tried to bury under another acquisition or another zero in his bank account. The insult at the marina had not been an isolated incident. It was the language through which Arthur interacted with the world. He saw people as assets or liabilities, tools or obstacles. His philanthropy was a calculated business expense, generating goodwill and tax deductions in equal measure. He chaired charity boards not out of compassion, but for the networking opportunities and the social capital they provided. Every smile was an investment, every handshake a transaction. Yet, as he sat in his silent palace, the silence screamed back at him, reminding him that in his ruthless pursuit of everything, he had ended up with nothing that truly mattered. The reflection in the darkened window showed a king on a throne of ice, ruling over an empty kingdom. His life was a fortress designed to keep intimacy out. Friendships were alliances. Romantic relationships were contractual arrangements that inevitably dissolved under the weight of his emotional sterility. He had built walls so high to protect himself from the poverty of his youth that he had inadvertently locked himself inside. The memory of his own father, a bitter, broken man who had worked himself to an early grave, was a ghost that drove him. He had sworn never to be weak, never to be powerless. But in achieving absolute power, he had sacrificed the very connections that might have given that power meaning. The humiliation of Ben Carter had been a reflexive act, the lashing out of a caged animal, and the unease it left behind was a crack in his armor. Miles away, in a modest bungalow in Cutler Bay, a different world existed. Ben Carter stepped through his front door, and the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by the warmth of a life built on love, not ledger books. The house was small, the furniture worn but comfortable, and the air smelled of his wife Sarah's cooking. Laughter spilled from the living room, a sound richer than any champagne toast at the Yacht Club. This was his kingdom, and it was filled with a wealth Arthur Sterling could never amass. The sting of the public shaming was still fresh, but here, surrounded by crayon drawings taped to the walls and the scent of home, it began to lose its power. His identity wasn't tied to a uniform or the deference of the rich. It was forged in the love of his family. Sarah met him in the hallway, her gentle eyes immediately sensing his distress. She was a schoolteacher, a woman with a quiet strength that had been his anchor for 20 years. She wrapped her arms around him, and in that simple embrace, he felt his rigid posture soften. "Tough day?" she asked softly, her hand stroking his back. He didn't need to recount the whole sordid affair. She could read the story in the tension of his shoulders. He simply nodded, burying his face in her hair. "Doesn't matter now," he murmured. "I'm home." This was his sanctuary, the place where the world's injustices could not touch the core of who he was, a husband and a father. It was the source of the quiet dignity Arthur had found so infuriating. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, came running from the living room, her bright, intelligent eyes sparkling with joy. "Daddy," she squealed, leaping into his arms. He lifted her effortlessly, her small frame feeling impossibly light. She was the center of his universe, a beacon of pure, unfiltered hope. However, a faint, almost imperceptible blue tinge to her lips was a constant, terrifying reminder of the fragility of her life. Lily was born with a complex congenital heart defect, a condition that had shadowed their lives with a constant threat of loss. Her laughter was the most beautiful sound in the world, but it was always underscored by a quiet fear that one day it might fall silent. Every moment with her was a precious gift. The call from his precinct captain came an hour later. Arthur Sterling had made good on his threat. The commissioner's office called. "Ben," his captain said, his voice heavy with regret. "They're putting you on administrative leave pending an internal review of the incident. It's bogus, and we both know it." The words were a punch to the gut. Administrative leave meant a suspension of his duties and a significant cut in his pay, a devastating blow for a family already struggling under the weight of mounting medical bills. The injustice was staggering. A billionaire's bruised ego had just jeopardized his family's financial stability and, by extension, Lily's access to the care she so desperately needed. The fight was no longer just about his pride. The next few days were a blur of worry for Ben and Sarah. The cost of Lily's medications alone was nearly $1,000 a month, a sum their insurance only partially covered. Her condition was degenerative. The doctors at Miami Children's Hospital had been clear that she would eventually need a highly specialized, multi-stage surgery that was not available locally. They had mentioned a pioneering surgeon in Switzerland, a man whose groundbreaking techniques offered the only real long-term hope. The estimated cost was a staggering $500,000, a figure so astronomically out of reach, it felt like a cruel joke. Ben's suspension felt like a door slamming shut on that distant, desperate hope. At the hospital for one of Lily's weekly checkups, the clinical reality of their situation was stark. The cardiology wing was a world of beeping machines, hushed conversations, and the brave smiles of sick children. Lily, despite her own frailty, had a remarkable capacity for empathy, often drawing pictures for the other kids in the waiting room. Ben watched her, a fierce, protective love swelling in his chest. He would do anything for her, fight anyone. But how could he fight a system that allowed a man's vanity to have such catastrophic consequences? He felt powerless, a feeling he had never experienced, not even when facing down armed criminals. This was a different kind of enemy, faceless, systemic, and utterly indifferent. Dr. Evans, Lily's cardiologist, met with them in his small, cluttered office. He was a kind man, but his expression was somber. The latest echocardiogram results were not good. "Her pulmonary artery pressure is increasing," he explained in gentle, clinical terms. "The stress on the right ventricle is becoming unsustainable. We need to start seriously considering the surgical options we discussed." He looked at them with profound sympathy. "We need to start planning for the procedure in Zurich. The window of opportunity for this kind of intervention is not infinite." The words hung in the air, a death sentence with a price tag attached. Ben gripped Sarah's hand, the cold dread washing over him once more. The hospital was a place of constant contrasts. In one wing, children fought for their lives in rooms filled with love and fear. In another, administrators and fundraisers courted wealthy benefactors, their conversations focused on endowments and naming rights. It was into this world that Arthur Sterling arrived one Tuesday morning, flanked by a PR team and a gaggle of hospital executives. He was there for a photo opportunity, presenting a comically oversized check for $2 million to fund a new diagnostic imaging center that would, of course, bear his name. It was a calculated act of public relations, designed to soften his public image as a corporate predator. He moved through the gleaming lobby with his practiced, artificial charm, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras. He delivered a short, polished speech about corporate responsibility and giving back to the community, his words as empty and sterile as the marble floors beneath his feet. He felt nothing for the place or its purpose. It was simply another stage on which to perform the role of the benevolent tycoon. His assistant had briefed him on the details, but they were just numbers on a page. The human cost of illness, the quiet desperation that filled these halls, was an abstraction he had never allowed himself to contemplate. He was insulated from such messy realities by layers of wealth and power. As the tour of the hospital continued, leading him through a less public corridor, he saw them. Standing near a water fountain was Officer Ben Carter, out of uniform, his face etched with a worry that transcended any on-the-job stress. Beside him, holding his hand, was a small, pale girl with enormous brown eyes, a hospital bracelet on her tiny wrist. For a moment, Arthur's brain failed to connect the dots. He saw only a man, a father, stripped of the uniform that had defined their previous encounter. Then, recognition hit him with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted slightly on its axis. The obstacle from the marina had a face, a family, and a pain that was raw and visible. Lily looked up at the procession of adults in suits and saw the tall, silver-haired man staring at them. Unafraid and unburdened by the context of their shared history, she offered him a small, hopeful smile. It was a simple, innocent gesture, but for Arthur, it was like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for decades. That smile, so pure and genuine in a world of transactional grins, bypassed all his defenses and struck something deep within him. It didn't ask for anything or seek to gain anything. It was just a moment of pure human connection. His own carefully constructed smile faltered, and for the first time in years, he was utterly, completely disarmed. The PR team guided him forward, but his mind was left behind in the hallway. The rest of the event was a blur. Arthur went through the motions, but the image of the officer and his smiling, sick child was seared into his brain. He couldn't shake it. Back in the silent, air-conditioned cocoon of his Rolls-Royce, he dismissed his driver for the day. He needed to be alone. He sat in the plush leather seat, the oversized check now just a meaningless piece of cardboard on the seat beside him. The $2 million he had just donated felt like an insult, a pittance compared to the profound human drama he had just witnessed. He had ruined a man's career over a piece of paper, and that man was now fighting for his daughter's life in a hospital wing Arthur's own money had helped build. The irony was suffocating. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamt not of stock prices or corporate takeovers, but of a small girl's smile in her father's haunted eyes. The dream morphed into a memory of his son, Mark, at that same age, before their relationship had fractured. He woke up in a cold sweat, the silence of his mansion more oppressive than ever. The fortress he had built was a prison, and he was its only inmate. For the first time, he felt an overwhelming, unfamiliar emotion, shame. It was a corrosive feeling, alien and deeply unsettling. He had spent his life accumulating power, only to realize he had used it to inflict pain on a decent man. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he made a call. Not to a lawyer or a fixer, but to a private investigator he kept on retainer for corporate espionage. "I need you to find out everything you can about a Port Authority officer named Ben Carter," he said, his voice low. "I want to know about his family, his service record, his financial situation, and I want to know about his daughter. Her name is Lily. Find out about her medical condition. Be discreet." It was a violation of privacy, another abuse of his power, but this time his motive was not to destroy, but to understand. He was a man who only knew how to solve problems with information and money, and he was now facing a problem of the soul. The investigator's report landed on his desk within 48 hours. It was a stark, heartbreaking document detailing Lily's rare heart condition, the family's financial struggles, and the astronomical cost of the only viable treatment. It also included a copy of Ben Carter's exemplary service record, filled with commendations for bravery and integrity. The report laid bare the full extent of the damage his arrogance had caused. The suspension was not just an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence for a child. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. Arthur Sterling, the master of the universe, felt small, petty, and monstrous. The numbers on the page represented a life, and he was complicit in threatening it. He read the medical section again and again, the complex terminology painting a terrifying picture of a tiny, malformed heart struggling to sustain a vibrant life. He saw Lily's smile in his mind and felt a desperate, protective urge. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since Mark was a boy. This wasn't about guilt or absolution anymore. It was something more primal. He couldn't undo the humiliation he had inflicted on Ben Carter, but he could intervene in the cosmic injustice that was threatening to steal his daughter. He picked up the phone and called the CEO of the hospital, a man who owed him several favors. "I want a private, off-the-record meeting with Dr. Evans, the head of pediatric cardiology," Arthur commanded. Tomorrow, Arthur arrived at the hospital through a private entrance, avoiding the publicity of his last visit. Dr. Evans, a man accustomed to dealing with wealthy donors, was prepared for a discussion about equipment or endowments. Instead, Arthur got straight to the point. "Tell me about Lily Carter," he said, his tone devoid of its usual arrogance. He listened intently for over an hour as the doctor explained the complexities of Lily's case, the high risks, and the slim but real hope offered by the Swiss surgeon, Dr. Aylman. Arthur absorbed every detail, his mind, usually occupied with market analysis and hostile takeovers, now focused entirely on the mechanics of a 7-year-old's failing heart. "What is stopping her from getting this surgery?" Arthur asked, though he already knew the answer. "The cost," Dr. Evans said simply. "It's a $500,000 procedure, plus transport and aftercare. The family doesn't have the resources, and insurance has classified it as experimental." Arthur stared out the window for a long moment, watching the city move below. What if the cost were no longer an issue? He asked, his voice quiet. The doctor looked at him, surprised. "If the funding were secured, we could contact Dr. Alleman's clinic immediately." It would. It would save her life. The words hung in the air, a simple, powerful truth. For Arthur, a man who dealt in billions, the sum was trivial, but the act of giving it felt monumental. His next step was far more difficult. He knew he couldn't just write a check. That was his old way, the transactional, soulless solution. This required something more. He needed to face the man he had wronged. But how? An apology from a man like him would sound hollow, an offer of money an insult. He decided to approach the situation through Lily. He had the hospital's gift shop deliver a rare illustrated edition of The Little Prince to her room with a simple, unsigned card that read, "For a girl with a brave heart." It was a small, anonymous gesture, the first step in a journey he didn't know how to navigate. He was venturing into the foreign territory of human decency, and he was terrified. Lily was delighted with the book. She showed it to Ben and Sarah, her eyes wide with wonder at the beautiful drawings. Ben, however, was immediately suspicious. "Who sent this?" he asked the nurse, who could only shrug and say it had been ordered by an anonymous benefactor. Ben's mind immediately went to Arthur Sterling. It had to be him. This was some kind of guilt offering, a rich man's attempt to wash his hands of the mess he'd made. The gesture, meant to be kind, only deepened Ben's resentment. He didn't want a billionaire's pity. He wanted his job back. He wanted to be able to provide for his own family, to save his own daughter with his own 2 hands. A few days later, another gift arrived, a state-of-the-art portable oxygen concentrator, much smaller and quieter than the clumsy one Lily was using. This was a practical, expensive piece of equipment that would significantly improve her quality of life. Again, it was anonymous. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, was torn. "Ben, whoever is doing this is helping her," she argued gently. "Does it really matter where it comes from? Our pride isn't more important than Lily's comfort." Ben knew she was right, but the feeling of being a charity case, especially at the hands of the man who had wronged him, was a bitter pill to swallow. He felt his role as a provider, as a protector, being usurped. Arthur, meanwhile, was growing bolder, driven by a need he still couldn't name. He began visiting the hospital, not the executive suites, but the pediatric wing. At first, he would just walk the halls, an awkward, out-of-place figure in a bespoke suit. He watched families coping with unimaginable stress, saw nurses performing small acts of kindness, and witnessed a world of quiet courage and profound love. He was an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. He saw Lily from a distance a few times, reading her new book in the ward's playroom. The sight of her, so fragile yet so engrossed in the story, solidified his resolve. He had to do more. He finally gathered the courage to approach her room. He found her alone, coloring in a drawing book. He knocked softly on the open door. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant. Lily looked up, her eyes showing no fear, only curiosity. "You're the man from the hallway," she said simply. "And you sent me the book." Arthur was taken aback. "How did you know?" he asked. She pointed to his sad eyes. "You have the same eyes as the little prince when he was lonely," she said with the unfiltered wisdom of a child. The observation struck Arthur with such force that he could barely breathe. A 7-year-old girl had seen straight through his billion-dollar facade to the empty man within. That was the beginning of their strange friendship. Arthur started visiting regularly, always when Ben was not there. He would bring her not extravagant gifts, but his time. He would read to her from The Little Prince, his deep voice filling the small, sterile room. He learned that she loved astronomy, so he brought her a high-powered telescope and set it up by her window, showing her the constellations on a star chart. He spoke to her not as a child, but as an equal. In turn, she spoke to him without artifice, asking him questions no one else dared to ask. "Why are you always alone?" she once inquired. "Don't you have a family?" The question was a dagger to his heart, but it was a pain he welcomed, a pain that made him feel real. He told her about Mark. He didn't offer a censored, polished version, but the sad, honest truth. He spoke of his own ambition, his neglect, and his deep regret. He confessed his loneliness to this small, sick child as he never could to another adult. Lily listened patiently, her small hand resting on his. "Maybe you just need to tell him you're sorry," she suggested, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. For Arthur, it felt like the hardest. But hearing it from her, the idea began to take root. She was teaching him a new language, the language of the heart, a language he had forgotten how to speak. The nurses on the ward grew accustomed to the sight of the imposing billionaire sitting by Lily's bedside, the two of them lost in conversation. They saw a change in him. The harsh lines around his eyes began to soften. He smiled more, and it was a genuine smile, not the corporate rictus he wore for the cameras. He was rediscovering a part of himself he thought had died long ago, the part that could connect, the part that could care. Lily's illness was a tragedy, but for Arthur, her spirit was a lifeline, pulling him from the wreckage of his own empty life. He was there to save her, but the truth was, she was the one saving him. Ben inevitably found out about the visits. A nurse, thinking she was doing a kindness, mentioned how wonderful it was that Mr. Sterling has taken such an interest in Lily. Ben felt a hot surge of rage. He stormed down to Lily's room and found Arthur there, helping her with the complex jigsaw puzzle of the solar system. "What do you think you're doing?" Ben demanded, his voice trembling with fury. "You have no right to be here. You get the hell away from my daughter." Arthur stood up slowly, his face a mixture of regret and sorrow. He didn't try to defend himself. He just looked at Ben with his newly sad eyes. "You're right," he said softly. "I have no right." The confrontation was brutal. Ben accused Arthur of trying to buy a clear conscience, of using his daughter as a prop in some twisted redemption play. "You think a few books and a telescope can make up for what you did," he spat. "You humiliated me. You cost me my job. You put my family's future at risk. And now you want to play the hero?" Every word was a hammer blow, and Arthur took them all without flinching. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. He saw the profound pain and fear behind Ben's anger, the terror of a father who felt he was failing to protect his child. "I can't make up for it," Arthur said, his voice raw with an emotion Ben had never heard from him. "Nothing I can do will ever make that right. I acted like a monster. But this is not about me. It's about her." He gestured towards Lily, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. "She is an extraordinary little girl, and she deserves a chance to live. Your pride and my shame don't matter. Only she matters." The raw honesty of his words cut through Ben's rage, leaving him confused and conflicted. He wanted to hate this man, but the person standing before him was not the same arrogant monster from the marina. He ordered Arthur to leave, and Arthur complied without argument. The incident left a deep rift between Ben and Sarah. "He's trying to help, Ben," Sarah pleaded that night. "He is our only hope, and you're pushing him away because of your pride." Ben shot back, "It's not pride, Sarah. It's about dignity. I don't want my daughter's life to be a gift from that man. She deserves to be saved by her father, not by his wallet." The argument was born of fear and helplessness, and it left them both exhausted and heartbroken. They were at an impasse, with Lily's life hanging in the balance. The external obstacle of money was being replaced by the internal obstacle of pride and distrust. Arthur was undeterred. He respected Ben's anger. He understood it, but he would not let it stop him. He began working behind the scenes, using his immense power not for personal gain, but for Lily. He contacted Dr. Aylman in Zurich directly, using his private jet to fly the surgeon's lead nurse to Miami for a consultation with Lily's medical team. He established a private, anonymous trust with his own money, naming the hospital as the trustee, with the sole purpose of covering all of Lily's current and future medical expenses. He was building a safety net, ensuring that even if Ben never accepted his help directly, Lily would be protected. He also made a call to the police commissioner. He didn't threaten or cajole. He simply said, "I made a serious mistake regarding Officer Ben Carter. I was arrogant and abusive. He is a good man who is doing his job. I am formally retracting my complaint and requesting that he be immediately reinstated with full back pay and a formal apology from my office." The commissioner was stunned into silence. Arthur Sterling was admitting fault, something no one thought possible. Within a day, Ben received a call from his captain. "You're back on the force, Ben," he said, bewildered. "Effective immediately. All charges dropped. I don't know what you did, but you must have an angel on your shoulder." Ben knew it wasn't an angel. It was Arthur Sterling. The act of getting his job back, while a relief, was also deeply unsettling. It was another demonstration of Sterling's power, a reminder that the man could ruin him or save him with a single phone call. He was a pawn in a rich man's game, his life and career subject to the whims of a billionaire. He went back to work, but the feeling of powerlessness lingered. He felt trapped, indebted to the man he despised most in the world. He was torn between his duty as a father to accept the help and his instinct as a man to reject the benefactor. Meanwhile, Arthur's quiet friendship with Lily continued, albeit more secretively. He would coordinate with Sarah to visit when Ben was on duty. Their bond deepened. He felt more himself with this 7-year-old girl than he did with anyone on his board of directors. She didn't want his money or his influence. She just wanted him to be present, to listen, to share a story. He started to see the world through her eyes, a world full of wonder and possibility, not just assets and liabilities. The walls of his prison were beginning to crumble, brick by brick, letting in a light he had long forgotten existed. The anonymous trust took care of all the mounting bills. The financial pressure on the Carter family eased, but the emotional tension remained. Ben knew where the money was coming from, and every cleared bill felt like a chain being wrapped around him. He saw the relief in Sarah's eyes, the improved care Lily was receiving, and he felt a profound conflict. Was his pride more important than his family's well-being? Could he learn to separate the man from the marina from the man who was now, for all intents and purposes, saving his daughter's life? He was a man of integrity, and this situation was testing the very core of his principles. Arthur, for his part, was undergoing a seismic shift. His company's board meetings seemed trivial, the endless pursuit of profit meaningless. He began delegating more, stepping back from the day-to-day ruthlessness that had defined his life. He spent his afternoons reading medical journals on pediatric cardiology, trying to understand the battle Lily was fighting. He was no longer just a benefactor. He was an advocate, an ally. He found himself thinking about legacy, not in terms of buildings bearing his name, but in the impact one life can have on another. Lily's courage was reshaping his own definition of strength. The preparations for the surgery were now secretly underway, funded by Arthur's trust. Dr. Alleman's team had reviewed Lily's case and agreed to take her on. A date was being tentatively set. The logistics were a complex dance of medical protocols and international travel, all orchestrated silently by Arthur's staff. He was moving mountains for this one child, using his formidable skills for a purpose that was entirely selfless. He expected no thanks, no recognition. His reward was the simple, unadulterated hope he saw in Lily's eyes during their clandestine visits. It was a purpose purer than any business deal he had ever made. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Arthur, after weeks of hesitation, finally called his son. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his past behavior. He simply said, "Mark, I'm sorry. I was a terrible father. I was a fool, and I let my ambition destroy the most important thing in my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to hear it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, for the first time in years, he heard his son's voice, not angry, but hesitant and soft. "What's her name, Dad?" Mark asked. Arthur was confused. "What do you mean?" Mark replied, "The woman who finally got you to do this." Arthur smiled, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. "Her name is Lily," he said, "and she's 7 years old." This act of reconciliation, inspired by Lily, was the final stage of his initial transformation. He had confronted his past and taken the first step toward healing his own broken family. The tension with Ben remained, a silent, unresolved conflict hanging over all of their heads. Arthur had fixed the practical problems, the job, the money, but the deeper emotional wound from that day at the marina still festered. He knew that before Lily's surgery, before they could move forward, he and Ben had to face each other once more, not as adversaries, but as two fathers bound by their love for the same child. The stage was set for a final emotional reckoning. The call came in the middle of the night. It was Dr. Evans, his voice stripped of its usual calm professionalism, replaced by an urgent gravity. Lily had suffered a pulmonary embolism. She was in the intensive care unit, stabilized for now, but her heart was under catastrophic strain. The slow, degenerative timeline they had been tracking had just been obliterated. The window of opportunity they thought they had, measured in months, had shrunk to a matter of days. "We have to act now, Ben," the doctor's voice crackled over the phone. "If we wait any longer, her heart won't be strong enough to survive the procedure. We need to get Dr. Aylman here this week, or we will lose her." The words were a series of hammer blows, shattering the fragile hope they had begun to build. Ben and Sarah rushed to the hospital, their world collapsing in a vortex of fear. They found Lily in an ICU cubicle, a small, fragile figure lost in a tangle of wires and tubes, her breathing shallow, aided by a ventilator. Seeing her like that, so utterly helpless, broke something inside Ben. All his strength, all his integrity, all his pride felt like useless trinkets in the face of this overwhelming medical crisis. He was her father, her protector, yet all he could do was stand behind a glass wall and watch as machines kept his daughter alive. The feeling of helplessness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that stole the very air from his lungs. Sarah wept silently beside him, their hands clasped in a desperate, shared terror. The hospital's administration, while sympathetic, was mired in protocol. Getting a European surgical team cleared for an emergency procedure in the United States involved a mountain of paperwork, visa clearances, and logistical nightmares. Even with the funding secured, the chief administrator explained, her face grim, getting the necessary approvals could take weeks. Dr. Alleman's schedule is booked a year in advance. Pulling him away for an unscheduled emergency on another continent is unprecedented. The word unprecedented sounded like a death sentence. The system, designed to be orderly and fair, was too slow, too rigid to save his daughter's life. Bureaucracy was about to kill his child, and there was nothing he could do. Ben felt the last of his resistance crumble, burned away by the fires of desperation. He knew there was only one person on earth who could cut through this red tape, one person who operated in a world where unprecedented was just a challenge to be overcome. Swallowing the last bitter remnants of his pride, he pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the number Arthur Sterling's personal assistant had given him weeks ago for emergencies. Making this call felt like a final surrender, an admission that he, Ben Carter, was not enough to save his own daughter. He was placing his family's fate entirely in the hands of the man who had once treated him as less than human. Arthur was in a board meeting in New York when the call came through. He had given explicit instructions that only one number was to be put through to him directly, under any circumstances. When his private phone vibrated, he knew. He excused himself, stepping into a soundproof anteroom. "Ben?" he answered, his heart pounding. He listened silently as Ben, his voice strained and broken, explained the situation. Arthur didn't need to hear the desperation. He felt it. His own transformation was put to the ultimate test. There was no hesitation, no calculation. The only thing that mattered was the clear, singular purpose that had come to define his life. "Lily, I'm on my way," he said. "Don't worry. I will handle it." What followed was a stunning display of the very power Arthur had once used so carelessly. He became a whirlwind of focused, decisive action. His first call was to his flight crew. "Have the G700 ready for immediate departure to Zurich. I want a flight plan that breaks the sound barrier if it has to." His second call was to Dr. Aylman himself, waking the surgeon in the middle of the Swiss night. He didn't ask. He implored, father to father, offering to donate $10 million to the surgeon's research foundation. "A little girl's life is on the line," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Please." His third call was to a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee. "I need emergency diplomatic clearance and medical visas for a Swiss surgical team. They need to be in Miami in 36 hours. Make it happen." He hung up the phone and his entire empire pivoted to this one task. His top lawyers began liaising with the State Department and medical boards. His logistics team arranged for a police escort for Dr. Alleman's team from the Zurich clinic to the airport. He chartered a second jet to fly in a specialized perfusion machine that Dr. Aylman required. Every obstacle Ben had faced, the bureaucracy, the scheduling, the international red tape, was systematically dismantled by Arthur's wealth and influence in a matter of minutes. He was wielding his power like a weapon, not for acquisition or revenge, but for the preservation of a single precious life. This was the man he could have been all along. Within hours, things at the hospital began to move with impossible speed. The administration received a call directly from the governor's office, authorizing the emergency procedure. The lead surgical nurse got an email from Dr. Alleman's office confirming he was en route. A specialized operating room was cleared and prepped. The hospital staff buzzed with disbelief, whispering about the mysterious, powerful force that had suddenly bent the entire system to its will. Ben and Sarah could only watch in stunned silence as the mountains, that had seemed insurmountable just hours before, were turned into dust. They knew who was responsible. Arthur Sterling was not just moving mountains. He was rewriting the rules of reality for their daughter. Arthur arrived at the hospital that evening, having flown down on a helicopter from his New York office. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a bespoke suit. He was in simple slacks and a cashmere sweater, his face pale and etched with the same fear and exhaustion that Ben felt. He looked not like a titan of industry, but like a worried grandfather. He found Ben in the desolate quiet of the ICU waiting room, staring blankly at a television screen displaying a muted news report about the stock market, a world that no longer seemed real. The air between them was thick with unspoken history, with anger and gratitude, with shame and hope. Ben looked up as Arthur approached. The rage he had harbored for so long was gone, replaced by a profound, weary sense of awe. "They said he's on his way," Ben said, his voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Aylman. They said he'll be here tomorrow morning." Arthur simply nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. He pulled up a chair and sat not across from Ben, but beside him, the two of them facing forward, a pair of soldiers in a shared trench, waiting for a battle to begin. The silence stretched on, no longer hostile, but heavy with the gravity of the moment, a silence of two fathers united by a common, terrifying love. "I never thanked you," Ben said, breaking the quiet, "for my job, for all of it." Arthur shook his head, his eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. "Don't," he said, his voice raspy. "There is nothing to thank me for. Everything that has happened, it is all because of me, the good and the bad. I started this." He finally turned to look at Ben, and in his eyes, Ben saw not a trace of the arrogant billionaire from the marina, but a man utterly broken and laid bare. "She saved me, Ben," Arthur confessed, his voice cracking. "I was a hollow man, a ghost rattling around in a life I'd built but couldn't live in. Your daughter. She showed me what it means to have a heart." He told Ben about his son, Mark, about the years of neglect, and the painful recent phone call. "I spent my whole life building an empire, thinking that was what a father was supposed to do," Arthur said, his words heavy with decades of regret. "Provide. Be strong. I built walls instead of a home. I pushed him away until there was nothing left but a memory of a little boy I used to know. I see you with Lily, and I see the father I should have been, the father I failed to be. It is the greatest regret of my life." The confession was raw, stripped of all artifice. A wound opened in the sterile quiet of the waiting room. Ben listened, and for the first time, he didn't just understand Arthur's actions. He understood his pain. He saw past the wealth and the power to the profound loneliness beneath. The man beside him was not a monster. He was just a man, flawed and broken, who had lost his way and was desperately trying to find his way back through an act of love for a child that was not his own. Ben's own anger, his pride, his resentment had all dissolved in that moment, washed away by a sudden, unexpected wave of empathy. He saw Arthur's humanity, and in doing so, he reconnected with his own. "She has a way of doing that," Ben said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "Seeing the good in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." In that shared acknowledgement of Lily's spirit, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer officer and tycoon, wronged and wrongdoer. They were simply two men, two fathers, bound together by the fragile life of a little girl in the next room. Their shared fear for her had become a bridge between their two vastly different worlds, a bridge built of vulnerability and a desperate shared hope. The first rays of dawn were beginning to streak the sky when a nurse came to tell them that Dr. Aylman had arrived and was scrubbing in. It was time. The two men stood up, their bodies stiff from the long, anxious night. They looked at each other, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Arthur extended a hand, not as a gesture of power, but as one of partnership, of shared humanity. "For Lily," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. Ben didn't hesitate. He took the hand, his grip firm and sure. "For Lily," he echoed. It was more than a handshake. It was a pact, a promise, a final absolution in the quiet hallway of a hospital on the edge of a miracle. As the nurses wheeled Lily's bed toward the operating theater, Ben and Arthur walked alongside her. Ben held one of her small hands, and Arthur, after a moment's hesitation and a nod from Ben, reached out and gently held the other. They walked together, this unlikely trio, toward the sterile double doors that held Lily's future. Sarah joined them, her hand on Ben's shoulder, her eyes conveying a silent gratitude to Arthur that spoke volumes. They were a family, forged in crisis, bound by love, and led by the quiet courage of a 7-year-old girl. As the doors swung shut, leaving them in the waiting room once more, they were no longer strangers or enemies. They were simply waiting for their daughter to come back to them. The surgery lasted for 9 agonizing hours. The world outside the waiting room ceased to exist. For Ben, Sarah, and Arthur, time stretched and compressed, each minute an eternity, each hour a fleeting moment of shared, silent prayer. They drank bitter coffee from styrofoam cups, made pointless small talk, and lapsed into long silences, united in their vigil. Arthur saw the depth of Ben and Sarah's love, a quiet, resilient force that humbled him. They, in turn, saw a man stripped of all pretense, his vulnerability as raw and exposed as their own. In that sterile, timeless space, they were not defined by their bank accounts or their past grievances. They were simply 3 people bound by their love for a little girl fighting for her life on the other side of the operating room doors. Finally, the double doors swung open, and Dr. Aylman emerged, pulling off his surgical mask. His face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes held the unmistakable light of triumph. He looked at the 3 of them, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "She was a fighter," he said, his voice accented, but clear. The procedure was extremely complex, but her heart is a marvel of engineering now. We were successful. She is stable and on her way to recovery. The words washed over them, a tidal wave of relief so powerful it almost brought them to their knees. Sarah collapsed into Ben's arms, sobbing with joy. Ben, his own eyes blurred with tears, looked over his wife's shoulder at Arthur, who stood with a hand against the wall for support, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent, cathartic sobs. Lily's recovery was slow but steady, a daily miracle they all witnessed. When she first woke in the recovery room, groggy and weak, the first people she saw were her parents and Arthur, standing together at her bedside. Her eyes, no longer clouded with pain, were clear and bright. She gave them a tiny, sleepy smile, a beacon of hope that illuminated the entire room. Arthur, seeing that smile, felt the last of his old, broken self fall away, replaced by a profound sense of purpose and a love so fierce it felt like his own heart was being reconstructed alongside hers. He was a constant presence during her recovery, reading to her, playing quiet games, and simply being there, a gentle, grandfatherly figure in her new life. The most tangible sign of her healing was the color returning to her skin. The faint blue tinge that had always shadowed her lips and nail beds was gone, replaced by a healthy, vibrant pink. Her breaths, once shallow and labored, were now deep and even. One afternoon, she laughed, a full, unrestrained peal of joy at one of Arthur's clumsy attempts at a magic trick. That sound, so pure and strong, was the most beautiful thing Arthur had ever heard, a symphony more magnificent than any he had ever commissioned. It was the sound of life, of a future that had been reclaimed from the brink. It was the sound of his own redemption. Every day she grew stronger, and with her, so did the bonds of their unlikely family. Weeks after Lily was discharged, the financial world was stunned by a brief news item. Arthur Sterling had sold his prized mega yacht, the Apex, for an undisclosed sum rumored to be north of $150 million. Pundits speculated about market downturns or a shift in his investment strategy. They couldn't have been more wrong. For Arthur, selling the yacht was a deeply symbolic act. He was shedding the ultimate symbol of his arrogance and isolation, the very stage upon which he had committed his greatest sin against Ben Carter. He felt no loss, only liberation. He was trading a hollow emblem of status for something real and lasting, divesting from the currency of ego and reinvesting everything in the currency of the heart. The purpose of that sale became clear a month later. At a press conference held not at a corporate headquarters, but at the Miami Children's Hospital, Arthur announced the formation of the Lily's Heart Foundation with an initial endowment of $250 million. Its mission was simple: to ensure that no child with a complex congenital heart defect would be denied life-saving treatment due to their family's financial situation. He spoke with a humility and passion that no one had ever seen from him before. True wealth is not measured by what you accumulate, he told the reporters, but by what you give away. A little girl taught me that. Her name is Lily Carter, and she is the true founder of this organization. His next journey was a personal one. He flew to Oregon, not on his private jet, but on a commercial flight, sitting in coach. He rented a simple car and drove to the small town where his son, Mark, lived. He found him in his workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and wood varnish, a world away from the glass towers of Arthur's life. There were no grand speeches. Arthur simply held out a piece of weathered oak. "I was told you're the best," he said, his voice quiet. "I need help. I'm trying to build something." Mark looked at his father, at the genuine plea in his eyes, and after a long, searching moment, he took the wood. "Okay, Dad," he said softly. "Let's see what we can build." Months later, the Carters' backyard was filled with laughter. It was Lily's 8th birthday, and the celebration was a simple affair with hot dogs, a bouncy castle, and a lopsided homemade cake. Ben was at the grill flipping burgers, a genuine, easy smile on his face. Sarah was organizing a game of tag, and in the middle of it all was Arthur, wearing a ridiculous party hat, allowing a group of squealing children, led by a vibrant and energetic Lily, to chase him around the yard. He was no longer Arthur Sterling, the billionaire titan. He was just Art, Lily's best friend, a beloved member of the family. The scene was a portrait of ordinary joy, yet for him, it was the most extraordinary experience of his life. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Ben brought 2 beers out to the porch where Arthur was sitting, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The sounds of their family's Mark had flown in for the party with his wife mingling in the warm air. "You know," Ben said, breaking the quiet, "I never thought I could forgive you for what you did that day at the marina." Arthur nodded, his gaze distant. "I never thought I could forgive myself," he replied. "But Lily did," Ben said, clapping him on the shoulder. "And if she can, I guess we can too." The forgiveness was complete, a bond of friendship forged in fire and grace. Arthur watched as Lily, her face glowing with happiness, released a firefly from her cupped hands, watching it spiral up into the darkening sky. In that moment, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him his entire life. He had spent decades chasing power and accumulating wealth, only to find that everything he had ever truly wanted was right here, in this small backyard, surrounded by the warmth of a family that had become his own. He had lost an empire of things and gained a universe of connection. True value, he now understood, was not in a stock portfolio or a yacht, but in the priceless, unbuyable love of a child and the quiet dignity of a good man's friendship. He was finally truly rich. 5 years later, the turquoise waters of Biscayne Bay sparkled under the Miami sun. A modest 30-foot sailboat named Lily's Hope cut gracefully through the waves. At the helm was Arthur, his hair now completely white, the harsh lines on his face softened into a permanent, gentle smile. Beside him, a vibrant, healthy 13-year-old Lily expertly adjusted the jib, her laughter carrying on the salty breeze. She had inherited his love for the sea, but their version of it was different. It wasn't about status or impressing others. It was about the shared quiet, the teamwork, and the freedom of the open water. The sea, once the backdrop for his greatest shame, was now the sanctuary of his greatest joy, a testament to his profound transformation. The Lily's Heart Foundation had become a national beacon of hope, having funded over 500 life-saving surgeries for children across the country. Ben Carter, now a respected lieutenant in the Port Authority, sat on its board of directors, his practical wisdom and unwavering integrity guiding its mission. Arthur's son, Mark, had moved back to Florida to help run the foundation, his relationship with his father fully healed, rebuilt on a new foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. Arthur had found what he never knew he was searching for, not just a family, but a legacy of love, a ripple effect of kindness that would continue long after he was gone, all sparked by the courage of one little girl. What do you think is the true measure of a person's wealth? Leave a little heart if you believe love is more powerful than any fortune. Subscribe for more stories about second chances. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in the power of human kindness.